The Senate Judiciary Committee hearing room fell silent as Jasmine Crockett adjusted the microphone in front of her. The freshman congresswoman from Texas sat upright, her burgundy suit perfectly pressed. Across from her, Senator Ted Cruz shuffled through his papers with the calm assurance of someone who rarely faced defeat in this chamber. What happened next, however, would become a defining moment. Before we move forward, make sure to like this video and subscribe so you never miss key political moments like the one you're about to witness. Because what follows is something few have ever seen. Ted Cruz, completely speechless. The tension in the room was undeniable. Cruz had already interrupted Crockett 5 times during her opening remarks on voting rights legislation, each interruption more dismissive than the last. Everyone could sense a 6th coming, but Crockett was ready. What was supposed to be a standard hearing was about to turn into one of the most talked-about exchanges of the year. "Senator Cruz," Crockett began, her voice steady but resolute. "I've counted your interruptions today, 5 so far. Let's see if you make it to 7 before I finish explaining why your arguments are not only wrong, but completely misinformed." The audience stirred. Cameras shifted to capture every angle. C-SPAN's viewership surged almost instantly. Cruz's confident demeanor began to waver, replaced by something rare, genuine discomfort. This was no ordinary committee hearing. It was the moment Jasmine Crockett, a first-term representative from Dallas, would do what many before her had failed to accomplish: challenge Ted Cruz on his own turf, using his own methods, in front of millions watching live. To understand the weight of that exchange, you need to know who these two figures are. Jasmine Crockett's rise wasn't expected. Just 2 years prior, she was a civil rights attorney in Dallas, taking on tough cases big law firms ignored, defending clients who couldn't afford representation, and confronting systemic injustice case by case. When she announced her run for Congress, insiders dismissed her. A young black woman from Texas, they said, could never make real change in Washington. But Crockett wasn't interested in following the old playbook. She intended to rewrite it. During her first months in office, she worked tirelessly, mastering every rule and procedural detail. While others gave speeches, she spent long nights in the Library of Congress studying half a century of debate transcripts. She knew that to reform the system, she had to understand it better than those who created it. Ted Cruz, on the other hand, embodied the political establishment. A Princeton and Harvard law graduate, former Solicitor General of Texas, and longtime senator, he had built his reputation on sharp intellect and debate dominance. His trademark move was the well-timed interruption, used to throw opponents off, break their rhythm, and seize control of the dialogue. For years, he had used this technique effectively against veteran lawmakers, cabinet officials, and policy experts. It wasn't just a habit, it was a carefully crafted strategy. And in 15 years, no one had managed to counter it. But that day's confrontation wasn't just about the voting rights bill. It was about something deeper. It was a battle over who holds the power to speak and who gets silenced. The proposed legislation aimed to restore voting protections that had been stripped away over the past decade. For Cruz, opposing it meant maintaining his party's political edge in Texas. For Crockett, it was about defending her constituents' right to be heard. People who often stood in line for hours just to cast their vote. Beneath the surface of the policy debate lay a deeper power struggle, the old establishment versus emerging voices. The real question was whether Washington would remain bound by traditional dominance and procedural control, or whether someone like Crockett could challenge that order. The hearing had been going for over 90 minutes. Senator Cruz was in full command, cutting off witnesses, redirecting conversations, and steering every exchange. Party affiliations didn't matter. When Cruz spoke, the room quieted. That was the norm. Then it was Representative Jasmine Crockett's turn. She was the last speaker of the day, and many assumed Cruz would relax. After all, both were Texans. A degree of courtesy was expected. But her composure unsettled him. She wasn't deferential. She skipped the usual pleasantries and spoke with confidence, as if her place there was unquestionable. Cruz noticed. The first interruption came 3 minutes in. Crockett was explaining the effects of polling site closures in Texas when Cruz cut in sharply. "Representative Crockett, surely you're not suggesting—" "Senator," she replied calmly, I'm in the middle of presenting data. I'll take your questions when I'm finished. Her tone was polite but assertive. Heads turned. It was rare for anyone to push back against Cruz's first interruption. He smiled, the practiced kind he used when challenged, part amusement, part dismissal. He leaned back, pretending patience, but his tapping fingers betrayed irritation. 2 minutes later came interruption number 2. Crockett was showing a map of polling site closures when Cruz leaned forward again. This data is misleading. Senator Cruz, Crockett interjected smoothly, you'll have a full chance to respond. For now, I'm presenting verified evidence that should be heard in full. She didn't raise her voice or look up. Her tone was steady and composed. The atmosphere shifted. Staffers stopped scrolling through their phones. Other senators leaned forward. Something unusual was happening. Cruz's interruptions were typically routine, almost expected. But few ever called them out. The third interruption was sharper. As Crockett discussed voter wait times, Cruz's voice cut through the air. This is absolutely ridiculous. You can't just present one-sided... Senator Cruz, that's 3, Crockett said evenly, her voice cutting cleanly through his words. She looked up, meeting his gaze. I'm counting. The room went silent. No one had ever said that aloud before. It was a small act, but it shifted everything. She had exposed his behavior in real time, visible and undeniable. I'm simply trying to ensure accuracy, Cruz replied. That's 4, Crockett said. Continuing without pause, the tension in the room deepened. Committee Chair Dick Durbin looked uncertain, unsure whether to intervene. But Crockett hadn't violated any rules. She was calm, direct, and precise. Still, everyone could sense the balance of power changing. The 5th interruption came in a different tone. Cruz lowered his voice, trying to sound composed. Representative Crockett, I think we'd all appreciate if you could clarify. 5, she noted, marking her papers. Senator Cruz, that's 5 interruptions in 10 minutes. Just curious, is that a Senate record or your personal best? Soft laughter rippled around the room. Someone at the back even clapped before being hushed. Cruz's expression tightened. He was trapped. Interrupt again and prove her point, or stay silent and lose control. But he couldn't help himself. As Crockett began citing voter testimonies, Cruz leaned into his mic again. These anecdotes don't represent... 6, Crockett said sharply, setting down her papers. The room froze. Senator Cruz, you've now interrupted me 6 times. Before you reach 7, I want you to know I came prepared. She pulled out a folder and lifted a stack of documents. I have here transcripts from the last 15 committee hearings you've attended. Would you like to know how often you interrupt female witnesses compared to male ones? Cruz blinked but stayed silent. The ratio is 4 to 1. You interrupt women 4 times more than men, and black women 6 times more. Particularly black women from Texas. She paused slightly. So let's just say I'm not the first. The room buzzed. Staffers began typing rapidly. Someone whispered, "This is going viral." Cruz looked stunned. His confidence faltered as he opened his mouth, then closed it again. That's an unfair characterization, he muttered. Is it? Crockett asked, flipping to another page. January 15th, you interrupted Professor Angela Davis 17 times in 30 minutes. February 3rd, Dr. Patricia Williams 12 times. March 22nd, Representative Nicole Collier 21 times. Shall I continue? Cruz's face drained of color. His composure cracked. No one met his eyes, not even his own colleagues. Senator John Kennedy stared into his coffee. Senator Josh Hawley looked up at the ceiling. This is an ambush, Cruz finally said. No, Senator, Crockett replied evenly. An ambush is interrupting someone 6 times while they present verified data. What I'm doing is called preparation. There's a difference. She turned back to her slides. Though everyone knew this exchange wasn't over, the room buzzed with tension. Cameras zoomed in on Cruz's face, flickering with visible frustration. Now, as I was saying before the 6th interruption, Crockett continued smoothly, the data clearly shows a consistent pattern of voter suppression, especially in Houston County. Cruz could barely contain himself. Losing control in public, and being counted for it, was more than his ego could handle. His reputation had been built on dominance, but pride drove him on. He leaned toward his microphone again, his tone laced with sarcasm. Representative Crockett, your little performance might impress your Twitter followers, but 7, the word echoed through the room. Crockett stood slowly, stepping beside her table so everyone could see her clearly. The silence was absolute. Even the background hum quieted. Senator Cruz, she began firmly, you've now interrupted me 7 times. 7 times you've tried to cut me off. 7 times you've tried to stop the American people from hearing the truth about our state. She clicked a remote. A video appeared behind her, footage of Cruz speaking at a recent event. The radical left, his recorded voice boomed, wants to silence conservative voices. They can't win on ideas, so they try to stop us from speaking. Crockett paused the video. Interesting philosophy, Senator, she said evenly. So tell me, what exactly are you doing right now? The room was still. The only sounds were the hum of the air conditioning and a few uneasy breaths. Cruz sat motionless, caught between anger and disbelief. A moment later described by photographers as when he realized he'd lost control of the narrative. But Crockett wasn't finished. You know what the real issue is, Senator? She continued, walking slowly along the table like a prosecutor. You've done this for so long you no longer see it. The constant interruptions, talking over people, ignoring voices that don't sound like yours. It's become a habit. She pressed the remote again. A montage began, clips of Cruz interrupting witnesses over the years. Women, people of color, activists, seniors, one after another. His voice cut through them all. That's inaccurate. You're misunderstanding my point. Let me explain what you mean. That's just not true. The clips formed, a near-rhythmic pattern of interruptions. When it ended, even some of Cruz's colleagues looked uneasy. Senator Susan Collins scribbled in her notebook. Senator Mitt Romney covered his mouth, but his expression said enough. More than 143 interruptions in 6 months, Crockett read from her notes. That's 1 interruption every 12 minutes of testimony. But when Fortune 500 CEOs testify, it drops to once every 45 minutes. When oil executives speak, once per hour. But when it's someone like me, it's every 3 minutes, Cruz finally spoke. This is character assassination. No, Senator, Crockett replied evenly. It's mathematics. Numbers don't lie. They carry no political bias. They simply reveal the truth. And the truth shows a clear, undeniable pattern. She walked back toward her seat but didn't sit. Instead, she opened a thick folder. Would you like to know what else my research uncovered, Senator? Cruz tightened his grip on the edge of his desk, his knuckles pale. This is not what this hearing is about, he said sharply. Oh, but it is, Crockett interrupted for the first time. This hearing concerns voting rights, about whose voices are heard and whose are silenced. And you, Senator Cruz, have just illustrated how that silencing takes place. She opened the folder. Let's review your voting record on election-related legislation. In 2019, you voted against the Voting Rights Advancement Act. In 2020, you opposed the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. In 2021, you voted against the For the People Act. And during those hearings, you interrupted witnesses supporting those bills an average of 8 times each. Those bills were examples of federal overreach, Cruz began, but Crockett cut in firmly. I'm not finished, Senator. I didn't come here to argue. I came to present evidence. Evidence that you've consistently worked to make voting more difficult, while dismissing or interrupting those who call attention to it. She unfolded a large map of Texas, pointing to marked counties. Here are the areas where polling places were closed. Your campaign received donations from organizations that actively lobbied for those closures. Is that just a coincidence? Cruz rose abruptly. I don't have to sit here and listen to these baseless claims. Then don't sit, Crockett replied sharply. Stand and be accountable. Stand and explain to the people of Texas why they should wait 8 hours in line to vote. Stand and tell them why their voices matter less than your donors. The room came alive. Staffers stood for a clearer view as C-SPAN cameras switched between Cruz and Crockett. Online, NARG 7 Interruptions was already trending. Cruz, drawing on years of debate experience, tried to regain control. Representative Crockett, he said, your performance today shows exactly what's wrong with modern politics. Instead of discussing real policy, You're creating a spectacle, grandstanding for social media while serious legislators try to work. This is why freshman representatives should learn to what, Senator? Crockett interrupted calmly. Learn to stay quiet? Learn to accept constant interruptions? Learn their place? She held up her phone for everyone to see. Do you know what this is, Senator? This is democracy in the 21st century. Right now, over 3 million people are watching this live, watching how you treat those who dare to disagree with you. 3 million voters are seeing, in real time, what you truly think of their right to be heard. She placed the phone down and lifted one final document. This, she said evenly, is a letter signed by every Democratic member of the Texas House of Representatives. Cruz stayed silent. He remained standing, but his posture had weakened, shoulders tense, face flushed, his confidence fading. This letter, Crockett continued, expresses their support for federal voting rights legislation. They've seen what happens when those protections vanish. They're tired of watching their constituents be systematically silenced. And finally, let me quote directly. We stand with Representative Crockett as she speaks truth to power, no matter how many times she's interrupted. Applause erupted across the chamber. It wasn't just Democrats, staffers, reporters, even some security officers joined in. The sound filled the room as Chairman Durbin pounded his gavel, struggling to restore order. Cruz leaned toward his microphone, shouting above the noise. This is a violation of committee rules. Chairman Durbin, I demand— 8, Crockett interjected smoothly. Laughter followed, not mocking but knowing. The kind that comes when truth becomes undeniable. Cruz froze, speechless. After a pause, he gathered his papers, turned, and walked out. The heavy door slammed behind him, echoing through the chamber. Cameras flashed, phones recorded, and the audience sat in stunned silence, realizing they had witnessed a moment bound to go viral. Crockett waited for calm before speaking again. Mr. Chairman, she said professionally, I'd like to continue my presentation on voting rights. Without interruption. It should take about 10 minutes. Durbin, still visibly shaken, nodded. The witness may proceed. Before she could continue, Senator Elizabeth Warren rose from the back and began a slow, deliberate clap. One by one, others joined. Democrats, independents, even a few Republicans. Something had shifted in that room. When the applause faded, Crockett resumed her testimony. For 10 uninterrupted minutes, she presented her findings clearly and precisely. No one spoke over her. As she finished, she gathered her materials and walked toward the door. Before leaving, she turned back with a faint smile. Oh, and Senator Cruz's interruption count today. That's actually below his average. Last year, he interrupted Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee 14 times in 20 minutes. So technically, this was progress. The room burst into laughter again as she exited, her footsteps echoing against the marble floor. Behind her, the committee buzzed with energy, the moment already flooding social media. Within an hour, her testimony became the most watched congressional hearing in C-SPAN history. News outlets called it the 7 interruptions heard around the world. Political analysts described it as one of the most effective takedowns of a senior senator ever broadcast. But the real success wasn't the confrontation, it was what followed. Crockett's data, her research, and her arguments about voter suppression dominated national headlines. The public conversation shifted from personalities to the issue itself. Cruz tried damage control, releasing a statement accusing Crockett of staging a viral stunt instead of focusing on policy. But his rebuttal was quickly overshadowed by newly resurfaced footage, clips of him interrupting female witnesses in past hearings. A viral compilation titled, "Ted Cruz Interrupts." Women for 10 minutes straight hit over 50 million views in just one day. Even some Republican colleagues began quietly distancing themselves. Senator John Cornyn was among the first, telling reporters, "Everyone deserves to be heard in committee hearings without unnecessary interruptions." Senator Lisa Murkowski was more direct. What we saw today was long overdue. But the most surprising response came from former Republican Senator Bob Corker, who tweeted, "I served with Ted Cruz for 6 years. What Representative Crockett did today is something many of us wanted to do, but never had the courage to. Bravo." Crockett's victory was undeniable. yet she avoided personal celebration. In every interview, she redirected attention to the central issue, voting rights. Speaking with CNN's Jake Tapper, she said, "This isn't about me versus anyone. It's about protecting every American's right to be heard." Senator Cruz said, "It's about ensuring every American has equal access to the ballot box. If highlighting interruptions helped people notice that, it was worth it." The fallout from what became known as the 7 interruptions hearing rippled through American politics quickly. Within 24 hours, the incident had moved beyond politics into popular culture. The number 7 became a meme, appearing in corporate meetings, family gatherings, and casual conversations whenever someone interrupted. Saturday Night Live aired sketches about it, and Stephen Colbert dedicated an entire monologue to the exchange. The real shift, however, occurred inside Congress. The very next day, during a Senate Foreign Relations Committee meeting, Senator Rand Paul began to interrupt a witness, then paused, saying, "I'm sorry. Please continue." Across Washington, witnesses noticed a change. Committee hearings began to feel more respectful. No one wanted to be the next Ted Cruz. Representative Jasmine Crockett quickly became a sensation, but not in the usual political sense. She didn't chase attention. She used it strategically. In every media appearance, she redirected conversations to voting rights. On The Daily Show, when asked about the confrontation, she highlighted a map showing closed polling locations. On The View, she brought 5 Texas voters who had been disenfranchised. The numbers told the story. C-SPAN, which usually attracted around 300,000 viewers for hearings, saw more than 45 million views of that exchange across platforms. Google searches for voting rights legislation surged 3,000%, and over 400 town halls on voting access were organized nationwide. Young Americans who had never watched a congressional hearing before were suddenly quoting parliamentary rules. Meanwhile, Ted Cruz faced a reality he rarely encountered: consequences. Even fellow Republicans began to distance themselves. At a GOP caucus meeting, Cruz tried to justify his behavior, but was met with what one senator described as Arctic silence. Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana summarized it succinctly: "When you're in a hole, stop digging." Cruz had brought more than arguments to the hearing. He'd brought an excavator, and it buried him. Corporate donors took note. 3 major Texas-based companies that had supported him announced they were reviewing political contributions. A petroleum company CEO told the Wall Street Journal anonymously, "We donate to politicians who can effectively represent our interests. Getting dismantled by a freshman congresswoman on national television doesn't qualify as effective." The most significant impact, however, came from within Texas. Just 3 days after the hearing, a statewide poll showed Cruz's approval rating had dropped 12 points. Even more striking, 67% of Texas Republicans said they were embarrassed by his behavior. At a long-planned Houston town hall, Cruz faced heckling from his own supporters. When he spoke over a constituent asking about health care, someone shouted, "That's one." The crowd laughed, and Cruz left after just 20 minutes. Meanwhile, the Texas Democratic Party recorded record volunteer sign-ups and donations. Beto O'Rourke, who narrowly lost to Cruz in 2018, tweeted, "Jasmine Crockett did in 18 minutes what I couldn't do in 18 months, showed Texas who Ted Cruz really is." Even Republicans began to reflect. Senator Marco Rubio told Politico, "We need to be better about letting people speak, especially when we disagree. The optics of interrupting witnesses, particularly women and minorities, are terrible and flat-out wrong." Soon after, the Senate Rules Committee held an emergency meeting to discuss limits on interruptions during testimony. Senator Amy Klobuchar introduced what became known as the Crockett Rule. Witnesses must be allowed to finish their opening statements without interruption. The rule passed unanimously, with Cruz voting in favor, though he did not attend the session in person. 2 weeks later, momentum returned to the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, which had been stalled for months. 3 Republican senators announced support for a revised version of the bill. Senator Mauski specifically cited Crockett's hearing. Representative Crockett's presentation showed we need serious discussion about voting access, not political theater. Crockett, meanwhile, handled her newfound influence carefully. She avoided overexposure, declining most media requests to focus on coalition building in Congress. She quietly met with Republican Texas representatives, identifying shared priorities on infrastructure and veterans issues. "I didn't come to Washington to go viral," she told her staff. "I came here to get things done." The impact extended beyond politics. Across corporate America, women began to push back against interruptions in meetings. Harvard Business Review published an article, "The Crockett Effect: How Counting Changes Conversation," noting a 40% drop in interruptions where the incident was cited. Universities began teaching the moment in political communication and leadership courses. A Georgetown professor called it a masterclass in preparation meeting opportunity, analyzing Crockett's timing, tone, and evidence frame by frame. Globally, the moment resonated. The BBC aired a segment on political takedowns, and a British MP tweeted that she was taking notes, calling it American political theater at its sharpest. 3 months later, when the voting rights bill came to a vote, something unprecedented occurred. Ted Cruz abstained. He didn't vote for it, but he didn't vote against it either, reportedly to avoid another public clash with Crockett, who was expected to testify. The bill passed by 2 votes. At the signing ceremony, President Biden invited Crockett to stand beside him. As he signed, he whispered, "7 interruptions, huh? I've been in the Senate for decades. Never saw anything like that." Crockett smiled, composed. The moment wasn't about her victory. It was about millions gaining access to the ballot box. Still, she allowed herself one quiet moment of satisfaction. As she exited, a reporter asked, "Representative Crockett, any message for Senator Cruz?" She paused, smiled slightly, and said, "I hope he's learned that every voice deserves to be heard." The reporter pressed, "Do you think he has?" Crockett replied, "He's been pretty quiet lately." That's a start. The incident's impact endured. Political science textbooks included the confrontation as a case study in effective communication. A documentary team followed Crockett for a year, producing an Emmy-winning film. Cruz attempted image rehabilitation, going on a listening tour in Texas, refraining from interruptions, hiring a new communications team, and even joking at a dinner. "I learned to count to 7 the hard way." Yet in every committee hearing after, someone was counting. A year later, at the Washington Press Club dinner, Crockett received the Political Moment of the Year award. In her speech, she reflected, "People ask if I planned it. I prepared for it. But you can't script authenticity. You can only be ready when the moment arrives. Senator Cruz gave me a chance to show what millions experience every day. Being silenced, talked over, dismissed." She paused, concluding, "Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is count. Count the interruptions, the votes, the closed polling places, the hours people wait to cast a ballot. Make the invisible visible. That's how change happens, one number at a time." The audience applauded, even some Republicans. Cruz wasn't there. His absence spoke volumes. As Crockett left the stage, a young intern approached. "Representative Crockett, thank you. I get interrupted all the time in meetings. Now I count. Knowing the number gives me power." Crockett smiled. "That's the thing about counting. Anyone can do it. You just need to pay attention and refuse to be silenced." The ripple effect continued. Political scientists tracked an interruption index, measuring how often lawmakers interrupted witnesses by gender, race, and age. Findings prompted reforms. In Texas, voter registration rose 23% in counties most affected by polling closures. Young candidates inspired by Crockett ran under the slogan, "Every voice counts." The Texas Tribune launched after 7, documenting the cultural shifts since the confrontation. Cruz eventually announced he would not seek re-election, officially citing new opportunities, but insiders understood his political power had waned. Yet the confrontation's true legacy wasn't Cruz's decline. It was the transformation of discourse. Hearings became more respectful. Witnesses were allowed to finish. "Let them finish" became a common refrain. 5 years later, Crockett was sworn in as a U.S. Senator from Texas, defeating Cruz's chosen successor by 15 points. Reflecting on the event, she told the New York Times, "I never planned to become the interruption counter. But sometimes history chooses your role. Ted Cruz thought he was putting me in my place. Instead, he gave me a platform." Asked if she ever spoke to Cruz again, Crockett smiled. He called about a year later to clear the air. "I let him talk for 5 minutes. Then I said, 'Senator, I need to interrupt you.' There was silence. Then he said, I deserve that. Cruz later taught a course on civil discourse and politics. When Crockett walked into the Senate for her first vote, she carried the same folder from the famous hearing, filled with transcripts and data she no longer needed, but refused to forget. Preparation, she understood, wasn't just about winning arguments. It was about changing the rules. The 7 interruptions became more than a viral moment. They marked a turning point in American political culture, showing that real power isn't who speaks loudest, but who refuses to be silenced. Jasmine Crockett didn't just defeat Ted Cruz. She rewrote the playbook for how voices are heard in power. Her lesson endures. Count the interruptions, make them visible, and never let anyone silence your voice.